I write this testimony in the hope that should anyone ever set foot in this chateau again, after I have performed the final act that will most likely end my existence, they will be aware of the terrible horrors that have occurred here. And should I fail in my attempt to put an end to this curse, may they avoid suffering the same unfortunate fate as mine. Despite the terror and frenzy that oppress me as I put on paper the following, I want to assure any readers that I am fully in possession of my mental faculties, even though I realize that what I have written in the absence of concrete evidence may seem like the absurd creation of a delirious mind or the macabre fantasy of a graphomaniac overly passionate about authors such as Poe and Bierce. As I write this letter, I have recently turned 32 years old. This information, curiously relevant, will be explained later on. My name and profession, on the contrary, hold no importance, but I include them to avoid excessive secrecy that could cast doubts on the truthfulness of this account. My name is Reginald Johnson. I was born and raised in Provo, Utah, and I am a former soldier of the American Army. I inherited this chateau approximately a year ago, on September 19, 1945, shortly after the end of the Second World War that devastated the old continent. Perhaps I should have anticipated finding myself in this situation, given that my fortune, and consequently this castle, stem from a terrible event that occurred towards the end of the war. In fact, just a few days after Hitler's death, before the Nuremberg trials were even conceived, hunting down Nazis had become the new favorite sport among us American heroes. It was during one such pursuit of a group of fleeing Nazis in the French Alps that my comrades and I, due to a sudden storm, quite unusual for the region and time of year, were forced to take refuge in this old abandoned chateau nestled on a hill hidden among the woods. The structure inside was evidently ancient, dating back, though I know little about architecture and even less about history, at least to the ages of feudalism. After a brief inspection, noting the general decay of the building, evidenced by peeling wallpaper, cracks in the walls, cobwebs, layers of dust several millimeters thick, and an unmistakable persistent smell of mold, we confirmed that the place was completely abandoned. The furnishings, entirely antiquated and devoid of any items from the current century, clearly reflected not the taste of its inhabitants, but rather prolonged neglect. However, surprisingly and contrary to what we had previously deduced, we discovered that the structure was not abandoned as long as we expected. Indeed, in the immense and well-stocked library located on the first floor, at the end of the majestic staircase dominating the entrance, we found that the collection of books was ominously and almost exclusively focused on the occult and black magic, and some of these books, particularly those we found on a modest desk placed under a window, were relatively recent. Among them was a certain Kybalion, a book on mental alchemy printed in 1908, and two books by the famous Aleister Crowley, The Book of Law and The Book of Lies. Therefore, my companions and I reflected that, at least up until 2 decades ago, someone must have inhabited or at least regularly frequented this castle. The theme of the occult did not suggest a reassuring sojourn, as although we were practically certain the structure was devoid of inhabitants, we couldn't be equally sure it wasn't regularly frequented by some group of Satan's worshippers or followers of some bizarre pagan cult. However, we did not particularly worry about this, as the storm continued unabated, and the castle represented our best chance to survive the night. Moreover, we reflected, what could possibly threaten 5 heavily armed American soldiers accustomed to the horrors of war? In a moment of brave wartime fanaticism, we almost wished that someone, perhaps the same Nazis we were hunting, had taken refuge in the castle so we could once again demonstrate the prowess of our trusted Colt pistols or our reliable M1 Garand rifles. At this point, 3 of my companions, Cole, Hendricks, and Sanchez, went outside to retrieve supplies from our jeep while Bishop and I continued exploring the building. Starting from the decadent yet majestic entrance, dominated by the grand staircase, we instinctively decided to explore the left wing. Here, we came upon a vast hall with a stunning and seemingly endless mahogany dining table at its center, flanked by a luxurious fireplace and illuminated by a single window overlooking a neglected inner courtyard, which appeared to have once served as a family cemetery. The hall exuded an aristocratic aura. In the middle of the table stood a lavishly ornamented porcelain flower vase, depicting war-themed motifs, indicating the chivalrous importance once held by the family who ruled this castle. The chivalric theme continued in other elements as well, such as the carvings on the plates, embroideries on the napkins, and even in the engravings on the golden goblets inscribed with the motto Honneur et Fidélité, honor and loyalty. Although I have no interest in history or art, I must admit I was momentarily captivated by the centuries-old splendor. However, I couldn't help but trivially consider the potential profits from selling such items on the black market. Yet, out of caution and to avoid planting the same idea in my companion's mind, I kept this thought to myself. What particularly caught our attention, and I must admit, disturbed us quite a bit, were the portraits of the counts of the lineage placed above the lavish fireplace. Curiously, the name of the noble family was always erased, as if someone had intentionally sought to obliterate the memory of a lineage long fallen into decay. On each metal plaque placed on the lower edge of the frames of the portraits, indeed, one could read Comte de C, but what that C referred to remained unknown. Yet, the most unsettling detail was another one. We noticed that, starting from the 13th century with Comte Henri, the paintings began to display discordant elements. Henri's portrait, for instance, was partially corroded, as if by some colorless liquid. The next portrait, that of Comte Godfrey, was pierced by a wooden arrow. Robert, Godfrey's son, had a vivid red stain on his chest, so vivid it made me think it was actual blood. Meanwhile, Louis, son of Robert, had a completely wrinkled and distorted portrait, as if it had been submerged in water for a prolonged period, and so on, until we reached the last heir, a certain Antoine, whose portrait showed no evident abnormalities. However, there were 2 singular details. Unlike his predecessors, who had all curiously died at the age of 32 starting from Comte Henri, Antoine had died at the age of 96 in 1914. The other aspect I dare not describe in detail, for even the mere recollection sends shivers down my spine. But for a moment it seemed as though the eyes of Comte Antoine were tainted with a demonic blackness and moved to observe me. This moment of terror, not shared by Bishop, who claimed to have noticed nothing unusual and attributed such a vision to sleep deprivation over the past 48 hours, was interrupted by the return of our companions. Before dinner, we decided to explore further. However, when we opened the door leading from the vast hall to the next room, we were overwhelmed by an indescribable stench of putrefaction. It was the kitchen, which was in a state so grotesque that resembled the living laboratory of an entomologist. The food, moldy for decades and now black as pitch, had attracted a vast population of worms, cockroaches, flies, and other disgusting and indescribable invertebrates. For a moment, it seemed to me that the assembly of repulsive creatures was arranged in a precise pattern, as if conveying a message. But if my deduction was correct, it remained completely incomprehensible to me. This cryptic vision triggered in me, beyond disgust, an unexpected state of anxiety, something I had not felt since the early days after landing in Normandy, when I was still a cadet unaware of the grim horrors of war. However, Despite our initial instinct to immediately close the door we had just opened and retreat, the stench and revulsion inexplicably faded after a few moments. We were instead drawn, almost hypnotically, by the golden glow emanating from a small ajar door leading off the kitchen. Following the source of light and pushing open the ajar door, we found ourselves in a large pantry room. Despite its proximity to the kitchen, there was no trace of insects or mold. Instead, it seemed permeated by a completely different atmosphere, gentle and reassuring. It was a sort of pristine, dreamlike oasis located in another dimension. Moments later, we spotted the origin of the brightness, and behold, it was enormous wooden chests containing treasures of every kind. Gold bars, nuggets, diamonds, emerald necklaces, rubies, various precious gemstones, coins, chalices, and idols. Captivated by such an indescribable sight that left us speechless, we eagerly rummaged through the treasures like gay children. However, the sense of wonder, at least from my perspective, didn't stop solely at marveling over the riches and fantasizing about a bright and prosperous future. What caught my attention were two sinister details. The first detail that caught my attention was the presence of some idols made from a material I couldn't accurately describe, and which no geologist or chemist could classify as well. Similar to gold, but distinctly different, it had a brilliance at least 10 times greater and an incredible vividness to the touch. These statuettes all depicted the same subject, a monstrous deity resembling a toad with bat-like ears and a body that couldn't be precisely attributed to any vertebrate class, showing characteristics both amphibian and mammalian. The bases of these statuettes, sometimes square, sometimes circular, always bore incomprehensible hieroglyphs. Despite my complete ignorance, I can assert that these were not Egyptian and likely not of earthly origin. The second detail was the presence, at the bottom of one of the chests, of a somewhat completely charred black cloak, emitting a strange chemical odor. I couldn't resist the temptation to examine it, but as soon as I touched it, I felt a sharp pain in the palm of my hand, which began to bleed. Unfolding the cloak, I noticed that wrapped and hidden within it was a dagger made of the same material as the statuettes and with the same kind of glyphs. My blood, dripping onto it, caused the hieroglyphs on its hilt to glow, as if a forbidden spell has been triggered. My first instinct was to bring the mysterious object to the attention of my companions, who were still entranced in a feverish state of ecstasy. However, after a few moments, I noticed something incredible. The wound on my palm had completely disappeared, and the engravings on the dagger were no longer illuminated. Attributing, as Bishop had previously suggested, these strange occurrences to prolonged sleep deprivation, I placed the cloak and dagger back into the chest. Then, I was taken by surprise by Sanchez, who handed me a little glass bottle of rum from Captain William Jones's distillery in New Caledonia, as my companions had found, in a dark corner of the pantry room, a large supply of alcohol. So, in a drunken frenzy, we celebrated the treasure we had just found, and we fell asleep. What happened next I would better not describe, as it risks completely compromising the credibility of my words to those who are entirely unaware of the reality hidden behind the veil of the tangible world. I remember having a strange dream in which I was transported to the main hall of the temple in a vast underground cavern. Despite being clearly at a great depth and there being no artificial lights present, everything around me was clearly visible, bathed in a bluish natural luminescence, likely emitted by some colony of invertebrate organisms that dwelled in such depths. Although I was aware it was just a dream, the vividness of the details made me think otherwise. I noticed I was among a group of hooded men dressed entirely in black, and I myself was similarly dressed. Then I noticed we were walking towards a large staircase at the end of the immense temple hall, made entirely of a very dark, rocky material that I couldn't describe with certainty, but which gave me the same feeling of otherworldliness as the metal of the statuettes and the dagger with which I had pierced my palm. At the top of the staircase was a large altar which bore the same hieroglyphs I had seen at the base of the idols, depicting a demonic being with sharp teeth and an extraordinarily long tongue, resembling that of a frog or a chameleon, inscribed within a sort of astral seal. However, what literally astounded me, which I had not noticed at first due to its immense size, as it seemed a natural extension of the surrounding environment, was that beyond the altar, in a state of ominous quiescence, there was the Toad God. The entity, as mentioned, was of gigantic proportions. Unexpectedly, its skin was not slimy like that of an amphibian, but rather scaly like the surrounding rock, and at times bristly like that of a gorilla or a bat. Sinisterly, it was identical to the depiction on the statuettes and appeared unconscious of our presence, posing no immediate threat. Although I was certain that, if awakened, it could unleash nothing less than pandemonium. Therefore, I chose to quietly follow the hooded men and refrain from actions that could threaten my life. Even though it was a dream, I had the curious sensation that the actions taken there would somehow reflect in reality. At this point, my fascinated yet terrified scrutiny was interrupted by one of the hooded men who detached himself from the group and approached the altar at the top of the staircase. When he turned towards us, revealing his face, I couldn't help but startle for a moment. Though undoubtedly human once, his face was evidently no longer so. The skin on his face was completely charred, as if he had suffered a severe burn long ago. But what unsettled me most were his eyes, so deep and sunken into his protruding cheekbones that they resembled the empty, malevolent sockets of a demon from hell. They creepily reminded me of the eyes that seemed to observe me when the painting of Comte Antoine took on a sinister vividness. Then the man, or perhaps I should say the creature, using his long skeletal and clawed hands, retrieved from the voluminous folds of his robe the same dagger I had found in the chest. He began reciting verses in Latin with a raucous and Mephistophelian voice. What he was saying I will never know, but I seemed to catch words like maledictio and sacrificium. After finishing his ritualistic prayer, the dagger emitted a brilliant glow, as if permeated with some magical force. The same happened to the astral seal on the altar behind him. Then the creature burst into a thunderous demonic laughter and stabbed itself in the chest. Instead of dying, however, it illuminated itself, and its dark charred skin underwent a kind of regeneration process, turning into a no less unsettling and marble-like skeletal white. In the meantime, I noticed that the other hooded men formed a circle around me, as if to prevent me from taking any action that might disrupt the sinister ritual, should I manage to overcome the paralysis induced by sheer terror. Up until that moment, since it was certainly a dream and I had not considered them more than mere holographic projections, I hadn't paid attention to the faces hidden under the hoods. However, what I saw, especially given what happened next, sent shivers down my spine, as I discovered they were none other than my comrades. Fear, however, soon gave way to compassion, for their gazes were not hostile but desperate, and as they opened wide their mouths in a silent plea for help, their bodies were enveloped in a slimy and enormous pinkish appendage. It was the tongue of the hideous Toad God, which with a sudden snap retreated back into the endless void of the huge, sharp-toothed mouth, carrying my helpless companions with it. Desperate for the inauspicious fate of my war brothers, and fearing that I was the next to suffer the infamous treatment, I tried to run toward the altar to stop whatever ritual the creature wielding the dagger was performing. But at this point, I suddenly awoke, and after a brief moment of relief, an even greater horror came upon me. For although I had escaped from the dreadful nightmare and returned to the suave tranquility of the pantry room in which we had fallen asleep, I noticed that my companions were, in fact, all gone. I was petrified for a long time in a state of silent terror, as if an invisible and obscure force was pushing me to stay with my back against the chest in which I had found the cursed dagger and on which I had previously fallen asleep. I hoped it was the frequent and not implausible cliché of the dream within a dream, and that I would soon wake up to tell my companions about the horrible and surreal visions that stress and alcohol must have induced in my sleep. But unfortunately, this did not happen. When, after a span of time I could not precisely quantify, I realized that my comrades were truly gone, I regained motion, albeit clumsily and overcome with nausea, and started to examine the room for any clue that might lead me to their tracks. Apparently there was nothing suspicious, except for a few overturned rum bottles on the floor, probably dropped by my companions as they fell asleep. I examined a few and noticed they all produced the characteristic pungent smell of ether, convincing me that the nightmare was likely just a consequence of poisoning and of the macabre suggestions I had experienced earlier. However, this left the mystery of my comrades' disappearance unsolved. For a moment, I found comfort in the idea that they had simply woken up before me and were waiting for me in the entrance hall, or that at worst, they had heard something that impelled them to leave without being able to wake me. So, holding my trusty Colt, I decided to go back and search for them. I traversed the kitchen again, which, though still in a state of putrid abandonment, was now totally and incredibly devoid of the numerous colonies of invertebrates we had observed earlier, and that seemed to convey some cryptic message. Passing through the room with the immense mahogany table, I paused to observe, through the only window present, the small courtyard outside, used by the Comte de C as a cemetery for those not belonging to the lineage. Particularly, I noticed that a tombstone with the engravings M.M. was half open, a detail to which I did not pay much attention at the moment, attributing it to the prolonged exposure to the weather and to the abandonment the tomb had been subjected to for at least a couple of decades, but the significance of which I would only understand a few hours later. When I returned to the entrance hall dominated by the majestic staircase, there was no trace of my companions. Therefore, I went outside and observed that our jeep was still there, under the relentless storm, making it impossible for them to have left. Then I went back inside, and despite I was experiencing nausea-induced dyspnea, I gathered all the breath I had left and started shouting their names repeatedly. However, the only response I received was the echo of my own voice. At this point, my instinct for self-preservation advised me to leave the cursed chateau forever, but I had to desist when I realized that Hendrix had the car keys, and it would be impossible for me to venture into the surrounding woods as long as the storm continued. Tormented by the terrible suggestion that something horrible could happen to me at any moment, and oppressed by a growing sense of nausea, I continued to explore the abandoned castle. For hours I wandered through the deserted corridors, decaying halls and labyrinthine ups and downs of half-destroyed staircases, until I finally reached, exhausted, the base of one of the oldest and most dilapidated turrets of the castle, nearby a sort of medieval prison. Observing it closely under the feeble light of a match, I noticed some traces of blood on the floor and walls, a detail that made me fear the worst for my companions, but which was not necessarily connected to them. It could have been animal blood, I said to myself, as it was not unlikely that pagan rituals were performed there, as we had previously supposed while exploring the occult library, and as suggested by the presence of sinister carvings engraved into the limestone walls of the cell, depicting astral seals and demonic creatures dwelling in the marine depths. Oppressed by a growing sense of anguish, I meticulously checked that my Colt was loaded, Then I ventured down an adjacent corridor so dark I could barely discern its details. After a few steps, I noticed the dry, brief sound of my footsteps suddenly changed in tone, producing a creak. Kneeling down to illuminate the floor with the last match at my disposal, I saw that beneath my feet was a moisture-laden trapdoor with a ring. I was ready to open it, eager to explore its secrets, when I was unexpectedly assailed by a glacial current from behind, extinguishing the fire and inducing me to turn swiftly, aiming my Colt into the darkness. I did not hesitate to pull the trigger, both to strike at a potential enemy and to utilize the gunpowder's combustion to cast light into the obscurity. Yet I neither struck nor glimpsed anything. Regaining my composure, my interest returned to the trapdoor, which I now had to locate by touch in the absence of light. Once I found and grasped the handle again, I managed to lift the trapdoor effortlessly, a fact that did not please me as the total absence of friction implied someone else had used it recently. However, before anxiety could dominate me, I was inundated by a sudden exhalation of noxious fumes, probably emanated by the great proliferation of molds in the underground. These fumes, magnifying the already present nausea caused by ether, made me startle for a moment, inducing me to vomit copiously. Only the fear of facing another horrid nightmare like the previous one kept me from fainting. Now, on all fours before the open trapdoor, I noticed the top of a stone staircase. Aware of the risks, but determined to find my companions, I decided to descend. During the long descent, I could not help but feel anguished, thinking of it as a metaphorical descent into the infernal realm of Satan, terrified by the hypothetical horrors I might face. My mind, now freed from the chains of reason, persistently projected unpleasant images of the skeletal creature and the gigantic toad god, making me fearful of encountering them at any moment. My body moved almost unconsciously, and after what felt like an interminable period, I reached the bottom, finding myself at the beginning of a narrow, seemingly endless stone-paved passage. Breathless due to the progressively scarcer oxygen in the underground, I entered it, moving with my back against one of the damp and rough walls that lined it. In total obscurity, I continued to torment myself with grotesque conjectures about the horrible fate that I was now certain awaited me at the end of the passage. Yet, driven by the desire to find my companions, the idea of turning back never once seemed reasonable. When I finally glimpsed the fissure marking the end of the narrow passage, I was surprised to see a soft bluish luminescence emanating from it. Upon emerging from the opening, I realized it was the same type of light that illuminated the subterranean cavern of my nightmare. And, in contrast to the reigning darkness, it poetically resembled the starry sky, and which curiously remembered me of the cryptic pattern donned by the invertebrates in the kitchen. However, this moment of blessed wonder abruptly ceased when I noticed, carved into the rock on the wall opposite the one I had emerged from, a solitary and fascinating massive oaken door. It was completely covered with the moisture of the place and with calcareous deposits that must have accumulated over decades. I had no doubt. If ever there was a clue that could lead me back to my companions, it had to be hidden behind that door. With my heart pounding so fiercely, it felt as though it might burst from my chest. I gripped my Colt in my right hand and prepared to seize the rusty handle with my left, when, behold! With a sinister creak, the door swung open spontaneously, revealing the malevolent figure of the skeletal creature that had, in my nightmare, sacrificed my companions to the monstrous toad god. The instinct to shoot, which had already arisen even before the unexpected apparition, was immediately suppressed by the creepy gleam of its hollow, abyssal eyes and the diabolic grin that followed. Before I could react, the creature began a terrifying monologue, dreadful both for its revelations as for the creature's hoarse, inhuman voice.
Foolish human, the moment has finally arrived. The moment to learn the bitter truth. Was that not what you sought? To understand whether the nightmare you experienced was merely a product of your mind, or the diabolical manifestation of a higher intellect. Well, I must confess that when your blood stained the hieroglyphs of the sacred dagger, you activated a seal that opened a portal to a reality unknown to most mortal men. Have you ever heard of the Cavern of Nikai, in the realm of Kenyan, where the slumbering Satogwa resides? Indeed, it is there that your companions met their end, elevating the meaning of their existences in sacrifice to the great Toad God. It is there that I, the great alchemist Charles Le Sorcier, son of Michel Mauvais, have resided weakly in incorporeal form for the past half-century, when Comte Antoine thwarted my plans, ending my long wanderings in the world of the living. But only a fool could believe he could break my curse, for since the 13th century, I have venerated and nourished the great Satogwa, the great God who granted me the infinite wisdom that allowed me to comprehend the secrets of alchemy and solve the mystery of eternal life. Even in life, I wandered arbitrarily between the world of light and that of eternal oblivion. Listen to these words, foolish creature. Even deprived of my corporeal form, I will always find a way to return to the realm of mortals. However, a mere specter has limited powers, and it is for this reason that I must be grateful to you, my dear stranger.
At this point, the frightening creature showed a slight sign of fatigue, beginning to cough and spit thick black blood. Then it continued.
When you die, your spirit weakens quickly, and you cannot act directly on material things. But you can induce those still living to perform acts on your behalf. And you, my unconscious servant, have perfectly fulfilled your task. But you see, the process is incomplete, and it is for this reason I have left you still in the world of the living. Although I have restored my old body, it is now too compromised to house my soul, and I do not have much time left. Therefore, you, dear human, will have the honor of being my new vessel of flesh and bone. But do not fear, I will let you wander a little longer in this world, for the bonds of alchemy are indissoluble, and I cannot claim your soul until you turn 32. So be joyful and enjoy the time you have left. In exchange, I give you this chateau and all the riches within it. But do not interpret this as an act of generosity, for when I come to claim your soul, I will take it all back.
Then the infernal creature erupted into a thunderous and diabolical laughter, concluding its speech and breaking the paralysis its unsettling and magnetic presence had induced in me. Regaining my composure, I did not hesitate to empty the entire magazine of the Colt at it, causing a bizarre dissolution of its body into a pile of dust that dispersed into the air. What happened next, I remember vaguely, as in a state of frenzy and terror I desperately sought an escape route from the wicked underground. Beyond the massive oaken door previously barricaded by the skeletal creature, I crossed into what appeared to be the Alchemist's laboratory. Mysterious potions, indecipherable scrolls, and precious metals apparently generated from some kind of furnace were all over the place. However, any sense of curiosity was suppressed instantly by the urgency to escape. Finally, I noticed a crack in the wall opposite the door through which I had entered, revealing a flight of stairs. Without hesitation, I ascended them with lightning speed, emerging in the cemetery courtyard through the semi-open tombstone I had observed earlier through the window, a passage that for centuries must have served as Charles Le Sorcier's secret route. I collapsed exhausted on the overgrown grass of the courtyard, and only after some time I realized that the storm had finally ceased. I walked to the nearest village to inform the local authorities about the disappearance of my brothers-in-arms. However, when I saw the mocking expressions on their faces, it became clear they regarded my story as nothing more than the ramblings of a soldier whose reason was completely compromised by all the horrors he had witnessed during the war. Disheartened, I decided to desist and refreshed myself at the Loire Ivre, where an extremely old, pale, bearded man wearing a skull cap and a weirdly familiar, voluminous black robe approached me to deliver a scroll declaring me the sole owner of the abandoned castle and all its contents. When I looked up to speak to him, he had vanished, and no one in the inn claimed to have seen him. For several months, I stayed in a room at the Loire Ivre, since the idea of sojourning in the accursed chateau never appealed to me, although for some time I visited it almost daily in the futile search for my companions. A few months ago, having given up hope of finding them, I even considered returning to Utah and starting a new life. Yet, as if some unseen force conspired against my escape, the captain of the vessel that was to bear me back to the States met a sudden and inexplicable demise on the very day of our departure, forcing me to stay in this limbo. However, in a few hours I will turn 32, and in the past 2 weeks the monstrous toad god and the diabolical alchemist have returned to haunt my dreams, claiming my sanity as a trophy. I don't know if it was all just a product of my imagination. Lately, I've even started to think that my companions never existed, since in the last days I realized that I'm suffering from some form of dementia or amnesia, often finding myself unconsciously returning from the chateau with my clothes stained by strange liquids. Sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see a pale, bearded old man instead of myself, and I question who I really am. Now, I must go, as I have written longer than intended. I will carry a load of dynamite into the castle's undergrounds and blow it all up, including myself, if necessary. If you have read this far, it's likely that I have failed in my intent and that the castle is still there. Therefore, listen to me and leave this place immediately, but before you do,